In this video, we'll be looking at the conventions of speech writing. Now, before we begin, just so you know, the baby is awake and feeling very chatty right now, so if you hear her in the background, I'm sorry. Hopefully it won't be too distracting. Okay, so speech writing. The most important thing to realise is that when you're writing a speech, you're writing for the ear. Speeches are made to be heard, not read. So you need to learn to write for how things sound rather than how they look, for the ear, not for the eye. Because of this, it's really important while you're writing your speech to make sure that you stop and read your speech aloud often. If there are parts where you find yourself tripping over the words or getting confused, if there are parts where you realize it's not clear what you're saying, if there's a place where you constantly find yourself saying something different instead of actually what's written, those can all be signs that you need to look at what's there and consider revising. When we're writing for the ear, we often rely on poetic techniques, especially things like rhythm, repetition, and alliteration. We need to rely on visuals because vivid visuals aid memory recall, so things like metaphor, imagery, symbolism, simile. And we also need to rely on signposting, which we'll talk about soon. Listening is hard, and unfortunately it's just getting harder because a lot of us don't get a lot of practice at just listening focusedly without having any visual aids to support it. When we read, we can understand about 30 words in a sentence, but when we're listening, we can only catch about 12 of those. So while it's important to make sure that your speech is pitched at the right level for your audience, don't dumb it down just because you know that they're not going to understand as many words in a sentence. You do need to be aware of the fact that our attention spans are shorter and our capacity to absorb information is shorter as well. So keep things short, sharp, and snappy. People can listen for about 90 minutes with understanding, but only about 20 minutes if you want them to actually retain that information. People need to be persuaded to listen. They need a reason to stay engaged because it's really easy to drift when we're listening and to start thinking about other things inside our head. So it's really important that you learn to relate to your audience. Poetic techniques are a really powerful tool when you're making a speech. Poetic techniques were originally invented essentially for speeches. Long before we had writing to write stories down and help us to remember things, you had people such as bards whose job it was to actually memorize these epically long stories and poems and to recite them for public entertainment. And the way that they were able to remember these stories and poems, even really, really long ones that went for hours and hours, was because of these poetic techniques and devices that enabled them to remember. So things like alliteration, which is where you have words beginning with the same sound. Sam slept silently. Assonance, which is, it's more subtle than alliteration, but it's a similar concept. It's where the middle sound of the word is the same. So round cloud. Round and cloud don't actually rhyme. They don't start with the same sound, but they both have the ow sound in the middle. Imagery, which is just creating really vivid images through your writing. Metaphor, which we know about, is comparing two different things in writing and often is used in imagery, or imagery is used in metaphor as well. Repetition, so repeating the same words or the same catchphrase over again. Reiteration, which is repeating your ideas in a different way but frequently. Rhyme, we're all familiar with. It's when the end of the word sounds the same. Cat, mat, sat, hat. Rhythm is to do with the beat of your words and the flow of your words. And a lot of phrases that become popular, things from speeches that filter down into the public conscience, do so because they have a particular rhythm to them. They sound right to the ear. And when you break them down, often they actually conform to one of the particular poetic meters perfectly, and that's why they sound so good. If you're interested in that, go away and do some reading about poetic meter. And then finally, simile, which is just a comparison using the words like or as. So persuasive techniques are also really important with speech writing. For information on that, go and see the videos on Pea in a Forest. And note also that personal pronouns can be really helpful to form that relationship bond with your audience that I was talking about earlier. So looking at vivid visuals. Good readers, when they read a story or they read an article, actually construct a movie in their mind while they're reading. They have a really intense, vivid mental picture of what's going on while they're reading, to the point that they actually lose consciousness of the fact that they're reading words, and all they see is just this movie playing out in their head. And good listeners do the same. So when they're listening, they're building up this visual picture in their head, and that's what helps them to stay focused while they're listening. So if you want your readers to stay focused, you can obviously help them to do that by providing lots of visual cues for them. So lots of metaphor, lots of simile, lots of imagery. Some examples from real life speeches we've got here. So honoured, the British Prime Minister has crossed an ocean to show his unity of purpose with America. We have that straight away, that visual there of crossing the ocean, that visual of distance, and then the word unity as well to contrast that. So it's a nice way of contrasting distance with unity, and it creates a good mental picture for the reader. The second one, we all realise that the most freshly dug graves belong to people our own age in Israel. That really vivid and slightly shocking image of freshly dug graves is a very strong, clear picture for the listener to grab onto. And then the final one, they were a fortress of strength, but what invading armies could never do, the silent artillery of time has done. It's a beautiful metaphor there, likening time to an artillery that's wearing down these people, whoever they are, that were not able to be conquered by any other invading armies. Again, just a really powerful visual image for the reader for the listener to imagine. Signposting is the other important thing that I mentioned. Listeners don't have paragraphs to help them. They don't have punctuation to help them, so they can't see where a sentence ends. They can't just back up and reread if they happen to miss a bit of what you're saying. They can't cross-reference bits of text to check that they match up or see how they relate. So you can't just flick back to the beginning if you wanted to check up on a point again. So it's absolutely vital that you, as the speech writer and the speech maker, do this for them. Signposting is how we do that. So words like firstly, secondly, thirdly, in conclusion, as I said earlier, following on from that, on the other hand, in contrast, however, because of this, as a result, and so on and so forth. There are a whole bunch of words that you can use around this. They're called either linking words or transitional phrases. And here's just a quick example of a chart that I found just now with a quick search on Pinterest. But if you just head to your favorite search engine and type in linking words or transitional phrases, you'll get a whole bunch of results there to give you some ideas. You can pause that and copy those down if you need to. So how do we go about creating this relationship with the listener that will convince them they actually want to listen to us? Well, first of all, you have to remind them constantly about why what you're saying is actually relevant to them, and you have to work at establishing a relationship from the outset. And you can do that either by relating to your audience or relating to your topic. So here are some examples of some famous speeches by famous people that do exactly that. They either relate to their audience or to their topic straight away. So this is a speech by Governor George W. Bush, July 10, 2000. And he says, "I'm pleased to be here. I'm also reminded of what the great Jackie Robinson once said when President Kennedy did something to upset him. Robinson said that he was sure the president was a fine man, but he reserved the right to change his opinion. For those who support me, I see one or two here, I hope you won't change your opinion. For those who don't, I hope you take Jackie's position as your own and give me a chance to tell you what is in my heart." So he's obviously speaking to an audience who he is hoping to persuade to support him. And he's stating, he's relating to them by stating up front, look, I know that most of you don't support me here, but I'm hoping that, as happened with this famous situation here, that you will just give me a chance. So straight away it gets his audience on side, because he's not trying to force them to agree with them. He's just saying, hey, I hope that you'll give me a chance. Some other examples, President Clinton at the prayer service in Oklahoma City in April 1995. "I'm honoured to be here today to represent the American people, but I have to tell you that Hillary and I also come as parents, as husband and wife, as people who were your neighbours for some of the best years of our lives." So he's connecting with his audience there by saying, look, yes, I might be here as the president, but hey, I'm just one of you. I'm a parent, a husband. I'm just a person who was a neighbour, just like you. And so again, that's using that concept of personal pronouns to connect with the audience and saying, we're alike, we're similar, we stand on common ground on this issue. And then President Clinton again in November of the same year at a eulogy for Yitzhak Rabin, who is an Israeli person. He says, I ask you, the people of Israel, on behalf of my nation that knows its own long litany of loss, from Abraham Lincoln to President Kennedy to Martin Luther King. So this is a really powerful way for him to start here, because he's saying, hey, I get where you're coming from. We have lost important people as well. Here is a whole bunch of important people that our country have lost. We know what it feels like. We sympathize. We connect with you. Note also there that he's also used a nice little piece of alliteration in there, long litany of loss. And it's even neater to note that l is quite a long sound as well. So a long litany of loss. The actual sound that it's using is emphasizing the length that he's talking about there as well. So the other way we talked about to relate is to relate to your audience, to your topic, pardon. So here's President Bush with the announcement of the new Freedom Initiative, which is a disabilities legislation that came in February 1st, 2002 in the United States. And he says, one of the things I enjoy most about my new job is the walk I get to take every single morning up the colonnade from the residence to the Oval Office. I say up because the path rises just slightly. It's been that way since they took out the steps so that Franklin Roosevelt could make it to his place of work. This house is among the first places in America to accommodate people with disabilities. So you can see how powerful that is as well by making that instant connection, going, hey, here's some disability legislation. We're on board with that. We've been doing that from the start. We get it. We understand how it is. Isn't that awesome? Now, whether or not you actually agree with that, totally up to you. But the point is, he's telling that anecdote to connect with the topic that he's presenting about. Another example of that, Columbia University student Mira Kogan, Solidarity Rally for Israel in 2002. And she says, but as college students, we all realize that the most freshly dug graves belong to people our own age in Israel. For when we college students see the faces of those soldiers who are protecting the land of Israel, the people of Israel and Jews worldwide, we see our own faces. So making that connection to the topic, saying, yes, we are college students, we're in America, but we understand it's college students, it's people our age that are dying over there, it's people our age who are sacrificing. We see our own faces in these people. So it's forcing their listener to make that instant connection and say, hey, these people are like us. So that's just a quick overview of some of the conventions of speech writing and some things to bear in mind. Hopefully you find that useful. Make sure when you're writing your own speech that you read it aloud and read it aloud often. And if you can, read it aloud to some willing volunteers who will be able to give you some feedback as to where they started tuning out, because that's a really good tip for you, that's where you need to start making it more interesting.